Hello, everyone. Welcome to Connecting with Ideas. What are the chances? And then we will talk about ancient philosophy. You have to start somewhere. And I'm going chronologically, right? I'm starting with the old stuff and we'll move up through time. There would be different ways you could do this, but that's how I'm doing it. So here we go. A very brief introduction, and it is very brief. In last week's lecture, I talked about philosophy and how it's impossible for me to give you more than I am able to. Does that make sense? What I mean is there's so much to do in this class. I'm not sure that any other Connecting with Ideas professor gives you any philosophy at all. And I like to because it really does connect ideas. And initially, I don't know that you will see that, but trust me on it. As we know more, there will be some bigger questions that we can answer. And that's the whole point of going to college, right? Is not only to answer questions, but to learn new questions that then you can spend more time answering. And that's kind of what makes it fun. So this is a very, very brief introduction to ancient philosophy. And one of the reasons it's very, very brief is I'm only doing Greeks, right? I'm starting with the Greeks for the ancient philosophy. I'm not doing any of the other cultures. And it's also very, very brief because I am not a professional philosopher. I think that 90% of what I tell you is correct. I don't know of things that I'm telling you that aren't, but I know in the past I have said things wrong and then I've read something and thought, oh, I always told the kids that Socrates was a peripatetic and he's not. Aristotle was a peripatetic. Anyway, little minor things like that. But we do have excellent philosophy professors at CWI. And so if you think any of this is interesting, I really encourage you to take a class in philosophy because it will open your mind to things you haven't seen before. Let's start with the pre-Socratics. So this is a long, long time ago, right? This is like maybe 7th century BC through the 5th century BC or so, and some of them even a little older, 8th or 9th century BC. And this is an interesting thing because the name of these fellows, and what are there? There's about a couple dozen that you could list off. It's not an exact number. It's not like you point. And basically what this means is there was a philosopher named Socrates, whom we will meet in just a couple minutes. And this is everyone who came before him. And it's an interesting concept that this fellow Socrates so revolutionized philosophy, so changed the way it was done, the way it was thought of, that everyone before him is kind of lumped together as, oh yeah, those guys. And in a sense, their ideas are less important, or considered incorrect in some way. It seems unfair. It seems kind of mean. This doesn't happen very often. It happened with Isaac Newton, right? He revolutionized math and physics. And so you talk about pre-Newtonian and post-Newtonian. It also happened with Einstein, who also revolutionized physics. So the pre-Socratics, as I say, there were about a couple dozen of them. And many of them, I'm going to mention a few, and I don't think I'll even write down their names. We'll just do a quick flyby. It's like when you're driving through Yellowstone and you say, "Hey, look, a moose," and you don't stop and chat with the moose. You just say, "Hey, look, a moose," and you kind of point, and we'll do that. Hey, Anaximander, it's a Greek name. Yeah, it just buzzes by. It's like those names if you've ever read Leviticus. Does anyone know those names? No, they're just names and they buzz by. These pre-Socratics, because Socrates was so important and so influential, and because everyone after Socrates did philosophy with some relation to Socrates' ideas, some of the pre-Socratics works are entirely lost, right? It's not like, oh, I'll just Google it, I'll put it on my Kindle, now I have a copy. No, these things were written out on papyrus or parchment scrolls. Time has not been good to some of them. Some of them people weren't interested in copying their ideas anymore because they were out of fashion. And so they were just lost. And some were never very popular, things like that. And so some of them, we have a few works of theirs. And some like Thales, I'll mention Thales probably first in line. Thales wrote a bunch of stuff. We have maybe a dozen sentences of his. I mean, that's all we have. Imagine your favorite author, and imagine if in 2,500 years everyone says, "Oh yeah, Shakespeare! Wow, what a great playwright." He said, "To be or not to be, that is the question," right? And there's a couple dozen sentences like that, but nobody has the book Romeo and Juliet, right? They don't have it. That's how some of these pre-Socratics are. So let me mention some names. The ancient Greeks had an idea of physics. What is everything made out of? And we wouldn't call it chemistry today, but they thought there were four substances. Well, I shouldn't say substances, four elements. So there was earth, air, fire, and water, right? And you've heard of this and you think, oh yeah, like the Indians. Yep. Oh, like the Chinese. Yep. Yeah, almost everybody in ancient times had this idea. And it's not a horrible idea. It's a good place to start if you're trying to understand stuff, but it can certainly be refined. Anyway, different pre-Socratics and different schools of pre-Socratics thought to themselves that reality had as its basis a certain one or more of these elements. And so, for example, Thales is said to have thought that everything is based in water. Everything comes from water. At its root, everything is really made out of water. And this was one of his ideas, according to Aristotle. Anaximenes, don't you love these Greek names? He thought everything was based in air, right? Everything's really air. That's where it comes from. And Diogenes of Apollonia, yeah, you don't care about these names. He also thought everything was air. Pythagoras, and you think Pythagoras, that's like the Pythagorean theorem. Yep, same guy. Not only a mathematician, but an ancient philosopher. Actually, he was more than either one of those. If he were alive today, he would be on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post all the time. And they would call him a religious cult leader, and they would say horrible things about him. And you think, wait, what? This is the a squared plus b squared equals c squared guy? Yep, same guy. He, I don't want to say demanded, but he received total abject obedience from his followers. They would get into an argument with someone, about Pythagoras's ideas. And the final settling was, there's a Latin phrase, ipse dixit, it means he said it, right? You're arguing back and forth and back and forth. And finally, the follower of Pythagoras says, well, Pythagoras said it. And that settles it, right? And people like that in modern times too, for various ideas, various followers. But that was Pythagoras. He did have some strange ideas. He had some good ideas. One of his good ideas was that he thought that everything is based not in one of the four elements, but everything is based in numbers. Numbers are these almost magical, mystical things. The world is harmonious, the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics developed this idea of the world being a harmony, an ordered thing. And the word they had for that was cosmos. And you think cosmos, like the cosmos? Yeah, that's the idea. That's where the word comes from. Cosmos means that it's ordered. It has the same root as cosmetics, right? When a woman orders her face, or a man, I don't want to seem sexist, whatever, you're putting things in order. Mascara, that's the secret to the universe. Anyway, they had this idea of the cosmos, and Pythagoras's idea was that everything came from numbers and everything was related in some way to ratios of, pretty small numbers. And one of the places he may have gotten this notion was ancient Greek musical instruments. So you think of the lyre. Nowadays, of course, you think of the violin or the guitar. If you've ever played a string instrument, you know that when you press your finger against a string and press it against the fretboard, it shortens the string, and shortening the string gives it a different sound. It gives it a higher pitch. And there are actually ratios to this. So if you have your guitar or your violin for that matter, whatever it is, and you measure the length of a string and you pluck it, dum, 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 and then you put your finger exactly halfway, right? Half is a small ratio. It's a ratio of 1 to 2, small numbers. This is a very Pythagorean idea. You press it against the string and put it in half, you get the octave higher. Instead of dum, 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 you get doom, 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 doom. My voice is not cooperating today. But anyway, yeah, it's an exact octave up. And if you go, well, how about if I go 3/5? And yeah, most of the musical intervals that you learn, do, re, mi, fa, si, la, ti, do, are ratios of small numbers. And so, yeah, Pythagoras, he's kind of onto something there. You almost think the quantum physicists, right? And they have, well, there's vibrations, right? It's string theory. What's everything made of? It kind of sounds like that sometimes. And of course, it's not the same thing, but it kind of reminds me of it. He had some really strange ideas. One of his weird ideas was people die because they eat beans. You think, wait, what? Yeah, that's why people die. If you didn't eat beans, you would never die. Too late for most of you. And then here's the thing, people come to Pythagoras or his followers and they say, well, what about Fred? He never ate beans and he died last week. I went to his funeral. We buried him. Well, the response, of course, is in the night, someone sneaked into Fred's house and put beans in his mouth. I mean, obviously, if he died, we know he ate beans. So there's always this, yep, there's a counter argument to anything. That was one of his more strange ideas. He was very, very committed to this idea that everything is made of ratios of small numbers. And the story goes that when one of his followers, I can't think of the name, you could Google it, when one of his followers came up with a proof, this was known in ancient times, that the square root of 2 is not a ratio of two small numbers, right? It's not a rational number, it's an irrational number, if you remember that from high school math. When Pythagoras was presented with this idea, how did Pythagoras respond? Well, in the simplest, most obvious way, he had the fellow put to death. Yeah. And of course, the Pythagoras' followers would all deny that. They would say, no, no, no. He fell overboard. There was a storm, and the deck was slippery. It's not like someone threw him into the Mediterranean. Yeah, probably someone threw him into the Mediterranean. So there's Pythagoras. Heraclitus, I don't know if you recognize the name, but he thought that the entire world, reality, the universe, everything was in a state of flux. And you might know his quotation, you cannot step in the same river twice, right? You step in a river and you just did it. And then you think, well, I'm going to do it again. No, it's a different river because it has flowed. The river has changed. And in fact, you've changed. Everything has changed. Everything is always in a state of flux. Zeno of Elias, he was kind of the opposite way. He said, no, things aren't in flux. Things don't change at all. And you may have heard paradoxes of Zeno that seem to prove, or at least if you assume that motion is possible, then Zeno's paradoxes, you reach a contradiction and you realize, whoa, this is hard to solve. What can we do? So that was a different view. Empedocles, now he's more of a generalist. He says, no, it's not earth, it's not air, it's not fire, it's not water. It's all four of these. Everything is based on all four of these. Democritus, okay, now Democritus, maybe this was the craziest guy of all. He had this notion, you're going to laugh when I tell you. He thought that everything is made out of little tiny, so small you can't see them, little tiny particles. And they're so small that you can't divide them, you can't cut them. And the Greek word for can't cut is atom. And so he said everything was made out of atoms, and you think, what? And of course, yeah, nowadays we think, well, atomic theory, sure, everything's made out of atoms. We've learned actually that you can cut them, right? We split the atom in the 1940s and created nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Democritus, yeah, he was kind of important. Karl Marx, if you've heard of that guy, his doctoral dissertation in Germany was on some of the ideas of Democritus. So there are some of the pre-Socratics, and as I say, it's just a flyby, and we're ignoring them because everyone kind of does nowadays. It's kind of sad. Some of them are very, very interesting. Some of them wrote things definitely worth reading and worth thinking about, but people don't do it very often. Even if you took a philosophy class, you might get one lecture, and then, yeah, then you're into the meat of things. You're into the real philosophers. You're into Socrates. So here comes Socrates. Socrates lived from 470 to 399, and you're thinking, what, he lived backwards? Yeah, these are BC dates. Sometimes people say, I'll mention this just because you'll see it sometimes, BC is the old, and I'm old, so I do it. It's the old notation, right? Before Christ, so 470 years before Christ. Nowadays, that's considered not entirely politically correct. It's kind of like, well, wait, what about Hindus or Chinese or Eskimos or, people who don't believe in Jesus, who don't put the importance on him that we in Western civilization do? And so there's a term you'll see sometimes in some academic writing, BCE, which stands for before current era. Um, and similarly, AD, right? Anno Domini, it means in the year of our Lord. We're in 2020 AD. People would say CE. We're in 2020 current era. And I'm old-fashioned, so I say BC. Apologies if it offends someone. So yeah, he lived to be ripe old age, 70 or 71 years old. He was from Athens. He was an Athenian through and through. He was born there. He died there. So I have to talk about the Delphic oracle. So there's a Greek island called Delphi, and it's not an easy place to get to. I mean, for one thing, you have to get on a boat or a ship and travel there. It's kind of an arduous journey. You don't want to go unless you need to go. But on this island of Delphi, for many, many, many centuries, there was this temple to Apollo. So Apollo is one of the Greek gods. He's the sister of Athena, that Athens is named after. And this Delphic oracle, the temple at Delphi, had a high priestess. She was called the Pythia. It's related to the word python, right? Pythia. Pythia, that was her title. And this high priestess had the power from Apollo. So Apollo, he's the god of wisdom, right? So that's kind of a good thing for a philosopher. He's the god of plagues, of rats, of music, of prophecy. And so here's this Delphic oracle. And what you would do is you take this arduous journey, and then there was a certain ceremony involved. It took a couple days to do all this. And of course, there was a fee. You'd make a small donation to the cause to pay for temple upkeep. I don't think they were raking it in. I sound cynical when I say that, but of course there's a fee. If you go to a church or something, yeah, put something in the plate. Don't be stingy. Anyway, so you're going to the temple of Apollo and you're going to ask the Pythia your question. And what kind of question? Well, some people would ask very ordinary questions, who should my son marry? This gal or that other gal? What should I plant on my farm next season? Barley or whatever. I don't know what they planted. And some questions were very, very ordinary from very ordinary people. And some questions were very, very earth-shaking, right? Should I invade the Persian Empire, right? And politicians, important leaders, emperors, Roman emperors used to come and ask questions. Diocletian came, the Roman emperor, and he asked a question, and the Pythian answered and said, Christianity will destroy the Roman Empire, and that's one of the reasons that Diocletian started his persecutions of Christians. Anyway, this is much, much, much later. I mean, that's 700 years later than this. The nice thing about the Delphic Oracle was that the answers were always correct. I mean, she was never, ever wrong. Nowadays, we have our so-called oracles. Just Google it. And sometimes you get a correct answer, and sometimes you don't. But the Delphic Oracle was always correct. And sometimes there was a little twist to things. Most of the responses were short, and they were usually in the form of a little poem, a couple or 3 lines long. Example, should I invade the Persian Empire? If you do, a great empire will be destroyed. Oh, okay. And so, yeah, then you invade the Persian Empire, and what you find out later is she meant your empire will be destroyed. But she also saved the Athenians against the Persians in other cases, right? The Pericles and the wall of wood, the wall of ships. So let's get back to philosophy. There's different versions of this story, right? These things happened a long time ago. This is almost 2,500 years ago, 2.5 millennia. That's a long time. And so we don't know exactly, but somebody, we think it's a friend of Socrates, and in one version of the story, we know the fellow's name, but you don't care. He goes to the Delphic Oracle and he asks a very simple question. Who is the wisest man? And think about it. Think of all the people you know, and not only just personally, but like everybody, who's the wisest man? And you think, oh, it's so-and-so, he wrote those books. And there are some popular people who are considered very, very wise. And when they publish new books, they're overnight bestsellers because they have such valuable insights. Some of those, I shouldn't criticize, I shouldn't mention this, but that thing, for example, and you'll know the fellow I'm talking about because he has a bunch of books and he's considered very, very wise. If you want to become an expert at something, spend 10,000 hours, right? And he's got the example of the Beatles, and he has a book about this. And everyone goes, oh, yeah, 10,000 words. I don't know that there's anything wrong with that idea. It certainly can't hurt. But speaking as a statistician, speaking as someone who has a somewhat skeptical eye, no, it just isn't right. And there are other things that people say, and you think, oh, wow, this is, and then you examine it and you realize, not so much. But think to yourself, who do you think is the wisest person? And maybe you'll say, well, it's Socrates. That's what the Delphic Oracle thought. And then you're thinking, well, no, it's not Socrates. It's, and pick your own favorite. Well, this friend comes back from Delphi and says, Socrates, you won't believe what just happened. I was at the temple and the Pythian said that you're the wisest man. And Socrates says, what? What? No, there's no way. I am definitely not the wisest man. And I'll prove it. It'll take me 10 minutes. I'll find a guy who's wiser than me. And so Socrates goes to a physician. And he says, hey, you're a physician? Yeah, I'm a physician. You're pretty wise, aren't you? Yeah, well, I know a lot of things about the body and about disease and about recovery and about diet. And yeah, I'm pretty wise. And Socrates says, well, let me ask you this then. And he gets in this conversation, and mostly he's asking questions. And after a while, Socrates realizes, this guy's talking through his hat half the time. This guy doesn't know near as much as he thinks he does. Huh. And so Socrates said, well, it was a good try, because you think a doctor is going to be pretty wise, right? They study lots of stuff. They're smart people. And so he goes to someone else. He goes to a shipbuilder. Hey, you build ships? Yeah, I build ships. Well, that's kind of complicated, isn't it? Well, yeah, kind of. There's all kinds of details. So you're pretty wise then. Well, yeah, I'd say I was. Well, then let me ask you this. And he gets into this conversation and he asks lots of questions, and it doesn't take him very long to realize this guy thinks he knows a lot more stuff than he actually knows. There are big gaps in this fellow's knowledge that he just doesn't see. He's not really very wise. And so then he goes to a politician, and you don't want to question politicians in public because it embarrasses them. And if they're powerful, that's not a good thing necessarily, especially in earlier times than ours. Nowadays you say anything you want. Watch the latest Borat movie. You can say anything you want about anybody. But in those times, maybe not. So Socrates, let's put two things here. One is this saying that Socrates had, and he had some great sayings. Oh, before I do that, I got to go back to the Delphic Oracle. So the Delphic Oracle had a pillar in its, I want to say lobby. It's not a lobby. It's kind of in the front. A pillar in the entranceway, in the main court. That's what I'm trying to say. And it had these three sayings on it. And one of these sayings was gnoti sauton. Gnoti sauton, which means know thyself. So this was advice from the temple of Apollo. Know thyself. And you think, you've heard this, right? You didn't know it came from, this is where it came from. And Socrates was very, very influenced by this. He thought this was very, very good advice. And there were a couple other things on this pillar. I'll let you Google them if you want. You can find out what they are. Socrates had this sort of motto for himself. He said, what I do not know, I do not think I know. And so he concluded with all this questioning and knowing himself and knowing that he knew his limits. He realized that's what the Delphic Oracle must have meant. He really was the wisest person. Huh. Well, in the meanwhile, he got a reputation as a gadfly. If you've ridden a horse, you know what a gadfly is. It's this fly that annoys the horses. And it doesn't kill the horse. It doesn't injure the horse severely, but it just annoys the heck out of the horse. And the horse is always, that's why they evolved tails, right? They're flipping their tails around, trying to get the gadflies away. And Socrates was kind of this person, as he'd walked up to someone on the street and say, hey, could I talk to you for a couple minutes? And he would ask him questions, and by the end of it, the person he's interrogating is pretty embarrassed because Socrates has made him look pretty stupid finding the holes in their knowledge. And I don't think he did this maliciously, but got kind of a following. Young men would follow him around town just to laugh at, yeah, politicians and puffed up people, right? That Socrates would take them down. Um, but Socrates did ask a lot of questions. He had conversations with lots and lots of people, and typically his conversation started with his knowing that he didn't know something. And so he'd be in a group, he's at a party, he's at someone's home, and there's some people there, and he says, "Hey, can I ask you something? What do you think justice is?" And the person says, "Justice? Well, you know what they say, might makes right. That's what justice is. Whoever's in charge, what they do, that's just." And then Socrates says, "Well, so you mean," and he asks questions. And so there's this Socratic questioning that goes on. And you've heard the phrase now, Socratic questioning. The idea is Socrates doesn't think he knows. He's not trying to lead the guy somewhere. He's trying to lead the person, lead the knowledge out, by asking questions. And these probing questions, this is good stuff. So you think, well, Socrates being so wise, what are the books he wrote? And I've read everything he wrote, because he wrote nothing. He didn't write anything at all. And you think, well, how do we know all this stuff about him? Well, sometimes his followers wrote stuff for him. So he did this for a long, long time, right? There's all sorts of stories we could tell about Socrates. His wife was named Xanthippe. She is recorded as being very shrewish. She was not the wife any man would want. And I'm not dissing on the ladies. I'm just telling you what Xanthippe was supposed to be like. I never met her, so I don't know. Maybe she was a very nice person, but the story is she wasn't. And still, Socrates recommended that you should get married. And he said, one of two things will happen. You'll be happy, or you'll become a philosopher, right? Because it gives you time to think and consider. But anyway, he wrote nothing. Later in life, because he was a gadfly, because he had these young men following him around and embarrassing important people, he was actually arrested. You're going to laugh at this. This is a great story. He was arrested for corrupting the youth. He was a bad influence. And a secondary charge, impiety. This is kind of a weird, thing. It's weird on a couple accounts. So one account is that ancient Greek religion was different from modern religion. If you think of a modern religion, what do you believe about God? The ancient Greeks kind of didn't care what you believed. They cared, if you live in Athens, for example, you better go to the Temple of Athena. They cared what you did, and what you thought, what your belief was, they kind of didn't care. But, there's certain sacrifices you're supposed to make on an annual or, whatever basis, and you should go do them. And why do you do them? Because it's part of society. It's part of living in a culture where, we live in Athens. Our town goddess, our city goddess is Athena. And so, yeah, we'll go. You could believe whatever you wanted, but you should participate in the ceremonies that all of your friends and neighbors were participating in. And so in that view, I'm kind of puzzled by, what do you mean? Why are you accusing someone of impiety? Because that's not so important. And then the other thing is, Socrates did have some strange ideas about the gods. For one thing, he thought they didn't really exist, but he did perform all the ceremonies, right? He seemed like a regular Joe as far as that goes. So I'm puzzled about the impiety. Corrupting the youth, well, yeah, obviously, he was corrupting the youth. And there was a nice trial. It went on for some time. Several hundred Athenians were the jurors, and they listened to the prosecution and the defense. Socrates spoke at length in his own defense. Despite his wonderful speech, he was convicted and he was sentenced. A typical sentence for something like this in those days was probably exile. You have to go to the island of Lesbos and spend the rest of your life there. And not even the rest of your life. Go for 10 years, go for 6 years. And for someone who lived in a place, it was a pretty bad thing to be forced to go somewhere else. It wasn't like you could just get on the internet, I'll work remotely. It doesn't matter. No, if you're away from your friends and family, you're away from your friends and family, and you don't see them, and there's very little contact. There's no mail service to speak of. So he was sentenced, except he wasn't sentenced to exile, which was also a puzzling thing. He was sentenced to death. This was kind of extreme. You think, wait, just because he embarrassed politicians? What? Yeah, Socrates' reputation nowadays, it's very, very good, right? Well, he's the wisest man, and all this philosophy starts with Socrates, and we recognize it. In ancient Athens, he kind of had a bum reputation. And you think of someone like, well, let's not mention any names. There are certain politicians, and there are certain satirical Saturday night TV shows, and I'm not saying any names, there's lots of them, you know. And certain Saturday night TV shows have a lot of fun with these certain politicians. And, you know, you watch and you laugh because, whoa, look at that. Well, the truth is the politicians aren't quite the way they're portrayed, right? There are exaggerations. In Socrates' case, the Greek playwright Aristophanes, this is a very famous playwright. We still have a lot of his plays. We've lost a few of them, but we have most of them. And they're very, very good. He wrote a play called The Birds about this so-called teacher named Socrates. And he had all these crazy ideas about cloud cuckoo land. And it's a very, very funny play. If you were an Athenian, well, you would want to go see this play. It's like going to see Hamilton, right, on Broadway. Well, some of the things in Hamilton, they're not exactly historically correct, right? For one thing, they didn't all dance and sing at the time of the Revolutionary War. And some of the ideas are a little off. Well, Aristophanes did the same sort of satirical take on Socrates and his teachings. And everyone who was anyone went and saw the play and laughed uproariously, and they kind of knew what Socrates was like. Well, and he wasn't like that at all. But as I say, he had a bad reputation, so he was sentenced to death. Well, fortunately for him, how do you kill people in those days? You force them to drink hemlock, right, which is this poisonous. It's a pine tree. It's a kind of a tree, a hemlock, and you get the leaves and you grind them up and you make a tea, and it's pretty deadly. You don't ever want to drink it. But this is what he was sentenced to death. Drink hemlock. Well, fortunately for Socrates, he had some good friends who had a little bit of money, and they bribed the guard, they bribed the jailer, and they arranged for a ship to take him away so that he would be safe. You know, and yeah, the Athenians, it wasn't like, we're going to extradite. No, if Socrates sailed away, he's good. He's only 70. He could live a while longer. So that was the good news. The bad news is that when Socrates' friends, his friend Crito, went to see him one early morning and said, hey, it's all fixed. You know, the jailer, he's with us. We gave him some cash, and we got a ship. It'll be at the dock tomorrow morning. And so, you know, we're going to take you there and get you out of here. And Socrates says, wait, what? Wait, what? He says, I'm a philosopher. I've always taught that there's a difference between right and wrong, that there's things people should do and there's things that people shouldn't do. And just the fact that I have lived in Athens all of my life presupposes a certain commitment, a certain promise to obey the laws of Athens. And the laws of Athens say that I have been sentenced to death. And for me to run away now, I mean, what would that look like? That goes against everything I believe and everything I teach. Yeah, but Socrates, you're going to die. Die? What? The soul's eternal. The soul's immortal. The soul never dies. My body will die. My soul will leave it. But I'm not going to die. Don't be sad. Dry your tears. And then what? He drinks the hemlock, right? You know, not right then and there. That's actually a different book. He drank hemlock. That's what happened to Socrates. We have some ideas. We have where he's from. We have some very basics about his background. We have what he wrote, and we know how he died. And that's that for Socrates. Let's move on to the next guy. The next guy is a fellow whose name is not, and you think, wait, you're telling me what his name isn't? Yeah, it's weird. The next guy is a fellow whose name is not Plato. And you think, Plato, I've heard of Plato. His name is Plato. No, it was actually a nickname. Plato's time was 428 to 348, so he's a little younger than Socrates. But he was his student. He was his prize student. He was his very best student. Plato, by the way, the nickname, it comes from the Greek word broad. We don't know exactly why he was called that, but the consensus is he had broad shoulders. He was a wrestler. And you think nowadays, a wrestler, a philosopher? No, you think of a philosopher as, this nebbish sort of fellow, kind of scrawny and wearing glasses, and they're probably thick glasses. You don't think, yeah, a philosopher, he's a wrestler. But Plato was a wrestler, had broad shoulders. His real name was Aristocles, if you care. Nobody knows that. I mean, people do, obviously. Where did I learn it? But yeah, no one calls him that. He's Plato. What did he do? He wrote down the teachings of Socrates. There's about 30 of these. And you say, well, how many? You mean, looks like it's 3.0. It's not. It's 30. 30 dialogues. So a couple things about these dialogues. They were conversations, right? They were Socrates sitting at a party and saying, hey, I know a fun game, right? He's at a drinking party. They're all getting drunk on Greek wine, which they used to drink out of bowls, not glasses. Yeah, fun fact to no one tell. So they're all getting rip-roaring drunk on wine. And he says, hey, let's go around the table and everybody tell what you think love is, right? Wouldn't that be interesting? And so, yeah, the Greek word for drinking party was symposium. And so there's a dialogue called the symposium. And if you're wondering what it's about love. And what is love? Socrates said he was an expert in erotics. It's like, whoa, what? I thought his wife was kind of yeah, but he said he was, there's a pun because erotike means erotic love in Greek and in English for that matter, erotic. But it's also related to the erotao, the Greek verb, which means to ask. Yeah, Socrates was an expert at asking questions and finding knowledge in people that they didn't know they had, because he started from a premise that he didn't know, and so he would ask. So he has one where he talks about love, and then he has one with a fellow named Io, and he says, hey, what do you think memory is? How do you think this works? And they talk about this stuff. And so the dialogues are kind of annoying because they're very desultory. They jump from topic to topic at times. And if you're thinking, well, I want to learn about Socrates' views of the soul, well, there's not a book that's called The Soul. There's a book called, it's a name of someone he was talking to. And so he talks to Io, and he talks to Crito, and he talks to Phaedo, Phaedo. He talks to, all these different people. And very, very rarely does the title of the book give you any hint about what its topic is. It wasn't really structured in the way we would structure a book. So Plato wrote these about 30 dialogues, and we say about 30 because some of them have been lost, a few have been lost, and a few of them that we do have, we look at them nowadays and we cast a skeptical eye on them and we say, Plato didn't write this, somebody else wrote it and said, by Plato, right? There was forgery in ancient times. There was a lot of forgery. It wasn't considered as bad as we would think about it now. And then here's the other thing, teachings of Socrates. Well, yeah, Plato wrote this and he says, Socrates said, and Glaucon answered, there's a conversation. But we weren't there. Did Socrates really believe these things? Or did Plato just say Socrates believed these things? There are some, and again, this is beyond my pay grade. I am not a professional philosopher, but there are philosophers who are able to point to some of the teachings and say, this is Socrates' idea, and this other thing isn't. This is Plato's own idea put in the mouth of Socrates. And one of the reasons we know this is Socrates' ideas change over time. And so scholars have identified, they've categorized these dialogues as early Plato, middle Plato, and late Plato. So he wrote these down. You may have heard of some of these. Plato's Republic. This talks about what justice is, and it talks about the best form of government and how it should be structured. Very interesting book. You may have read it in high school. I've known high school classes that read it. If you haven't read it, read it sometime. Plato did found a school. Socrates didn't have a school. He just had a bunch of people that clustered around him. He was very popular among the people who liked him. He founded a school. It was called the Academy. And you think, Academy, that's like, yeah, and that's why it's called the Academy, in honor of Plato, because everyone respects these people so much that we remember the names of their schools. So if you're interested in academic success, yeah, it's because of Plato's school. It was called the Academy. It had a slogan above the door, Ageometretos me eisito. And this is the prerequisite. And you think to yourself, well, yeah, what do you have to know in order to study? I'd like to take a math class. Well, there's a prereq, right? I want to take chemistry. Well, you have to take some math. I want to take a Shakespeare class. Well, you have to take English Comp, English 101 first. So you know about prerequisites because you're in college. This is Plato's prerequisite. This ageometretos me eisito. Me eisito means don't let anyone in. And then ageometretos means if they have not already studied geometry, right? Is that what you were guessing? You think, well, if you want to study philosophy, obviously you need to know geometry. It's kind of a funny idea to us nowadays, but Plato's intention was if you study geometry, then you learn to make careful definitions and you learn to argue, right? You remember 10th grade geometry? It wasn't pleasant, but yeah, if you haven't totally repressed it, there were proofs, right? There were theorems, and there was a very careful thought, and there was step-by-step reasoning. And so this was the idea. Plato said, you need to know some geometry just so you have this mental toolkit. And then we'll talk about something that has nothing to do with geometry. Although there's a nice example of Socrates with a slave boy, and he asks him questions. Hey, if you drew a triangle, and then what? And he draws out from this uneducated, illiterate boy, he draws out the Pythagorean theorem. And he says, see, he knew it all along. He just didn't know he knew. How important is Plato? So Alfred North Whitehead, this is a British philosopher, early 20th century, also a mathematician. He's very famously quoted, and I'm not quoting him exact. I shouldn't put quote marks because this is a paraphrase. I should look it up sometime and learn the exact words. All Western philosophy consists really of nothing more than footnotes to Plato. That's how important Plato is. Love him or hate him, agree with him or disagree with him, he's very, very important in the history of ideas. So there's Plato. So this third personality, we had Socrates, and then after him came Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates. We now move to Aristotle. So Aristotle's dates are 384 to 322 BC. So again, he's just a little younger. There's this generational thing going on. He was a student of Plato. And of course, there's a development of ideas. Plato, we already pointed out, did not agree with everything Socrates said. And Aristotle had quite a few differences with Plato. Plato wrote the Socratic dialogues. He wrote all of the teachings of Socrates in the form of conversations. Aristotle wrote about everything. I mean, he wrote about everything. He wrote on natural science. He's considered one of the earliest, one of the best physicists. And Aristotle's ideas on physics and how things worked, these were the official science, the science. If you studied science, you would study Aristotle, because he knew this stuff, probably until, say, the 1200s. And then people started noticing, wait, there's some things he got wrong. Yeah, he thought that if you dropped a heavy thing and a light thing, well, the heavy thing falls faster because, it's heavy. His explanation for gravity, it's quaint, but it's not very accurate. His idea was, yeah, there's 4 elements, right? Earth, air, fire, and water. And Earth is the heaviest. No. Yeah, Earth is the heaviest, and then water, and then air, and then fire. And why is fire the lightest? Well, smoke rises. You've seen it. And air, it's up above the water. The water's below, and under the waters, there's the ground. And so obviously these are the weights of these 4 things. And then there's a like attracts like. And so you are made of, pretty much earth, right? There's some water in you also, but you're pretty much earth. And so your earth is attracted to the earth, and that's gravity. That's why you don't go flying off into space. I don't know if they had the idea of flying off into space, but this was his explanation for gravity. How come rocks fall when you let go of them? because they're trying to get closer to the earth because they're made of earth. And so this was the explanation for gravity. And you think that doesn't sound very scientific, Gary. Yeah, but Aristotle really was a good scientist. I mean, he was a research scientist. He wrote about in the natural sciences. He was a very good zoologist, biologist for his day. He used to go down to the docks. Athens is a town that has a nice harbor, the Piraeus, and he would ask fishermen for fish that they didn't want. Hey, you got a fish, catch anything interesting today? And he would dissect these and he would study them and he would try to understand them by actually getting his hands dirty. So he wrote about natural science. He wrote about philosophy. So in the lecture from last week, if you've watched the video, you know that there are 5 branches of philosophy. Aristotle, he's the one who listed these out. His writings on philosophy are very, very structured. They're very, very organized. When he writes a book about the soul, it's called About the Soul, and that's the title of the book. When he writes a book about logic and reasoning, it's called Logic. And when he writes a book about politics, it's called Politics. Ethics, he has several books with ethics in the title. Unfortunately for Aristotle's writings, a lot of them are lost, probably half of them. There were 2 sorts of writings. There were the general consumption, right, popularizations, and then there was kind of the inner circle writing. And we've lost a lot of all of it. Literary criticism, right? So in your 9th grade English class, you read, what did you read? You read Romeo and Juliet, and you learned this was a tragedy. And why is it a tragedy? Because here's this person and he's good. You read Othello. And why is it a tragedy? Here's this person that's good, but he has one flaw. And that's the idea of a tragedy, is there's a good person and we'll tell a story about them, but this person has one flaw that destroys their life. And that's the notion of a tragedy. And then you want to analyze some more and you say, well, there's a protagonist. This is the person pushing the action, and the antagonist, and that's the person opposing the action. And the action reaches a height, which is the climax, right? Climax is the Greek word for ladder. It reaches a height. And you think, oh yeah, I remember all this from 9th grade. All of those words are from Aristotle's book on poetics. They didn't tell you in 9th grade, but you were studying Aristotelian philosophy. He did write about the soul and the mind. He thought that there were 3 different types of souls. You could call him the first psychologist. He really was the very first psychologist we know of. He wrote about psychology and how do people think, and what's the relationship between the soul and the body, things like this. He also founded a school. It's called the Lyceum. Oh, just like 20, 30 years ago, very recently, they found it, right? They were digging. I want to say it was some civic project, right? They were building something in Athens, and so they were doing some excavation. I want to say it has something to do with natural gas, but that sounds wrong. Why would they? I mean, they weren't digging an oil well, obviously. Anyway, there was some construction and some excavation, and they found it. And it's not like, oh, here's the building. No, it's some foundation stones, and so they stopped the construction. They said, your project has to go somewhere else, parking lot or bank, whatever it was. And you can go to Athens and you can go there and see it. And it kind of looks like a field with some rocks. But, if you're that person, gosh, what wonderful memories. If you learned French in high school, the French word for high school, the French word for high school, you may have learned it. It's lycée, spelled Lycee. And that's named after, in the same way that academy became the name, lyceum became the name, and quite a few European languages have something like lyceum as a name for a school. He had a number of very fine students. We know some of their names. They wrote commentaries on his works. Some of his works, by the way, he wrote about everything. Sometimes it was a lecture, right? He would talk about things. And he had this peripatetic style, meaning he walked around and people would walk around with him. The Lyceum, it's not like it's one building, it's acres and acres of it. It's a big, big place. And he would walk around up and down. His students would walk with him and he would talk about stuff. Some of his students wrote these things down, and some of Aristotle's writings are actually written by his students, a few of them. He tutored privately. He had to leave Athens for this, but he had a friend named Philip, who was from a place kind of northwest, I guess, of Greece, northeast, I want to say, in Macedon. And Philip had a son named Alexander, and Aristotle had a reputation for being pretty brainy. And Philip had a lot of cash, and so he said, "Wouldn't you like to come and tutor my boy Alexander?" And I would say that Aristotle did a great job tutoring Alexander, and so Alexander grew up to be pretty great. Yep, he was Alexander the Great. His father was Philip of Macedon. Alexander the Great conquered the entire world. I mean, not the entire world, but it went from the Mediterranean all the way to India. This was the Greek Empire of Alexander. And then Alexander died and it broke up. But yeah, you have to wonder how much of Alexander's success was because of his being a student of Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle knew some stuff. He was a pretty wise person.